everybody. This week on Geekerati, we're going to be discussing the DragonQuest role-playing game and its place in gaming history. It's kind of a unique one, and the amazing thing about DragonQuest is, as obscure as the game itself is, it actually has a very interesting and very substantial literary legacy.
Hello, and welcome to Geekerati.
For geeks, by geeks, and with geeks.
Life and love of the earth. Welcome to Overtime.
Brave enough to do battle with hideous monsters.
I am Sinistar.
Hello and welcome to Geekerati. I'm Christian Lindke, and today we're going to be talking about 1980's DragonQuest role-playing game. A role-playing game that shows what happens when token and map wargame designers build a role-playing game. To give a bit of background here, in 1977, a wargaming giant decided to enter the RPG market. In 1977, Simulations Publications Incorporated published a book entitled Wargame Design: The History, Production, and Use of Conflict Simulation Games. Here's a copy of it right here. This book is one of the great artifacts of the wargaming hobby and is an invaluable resource that provides accurate historical information about the state of wargaming and the wargaming industry in 1977. A couple of other great wargaming books from a similar era are The Best Board War Games by Nicholas Palmer and The Complete Book of War Games by John Freeman. Both of those go into different aspects of the wargaming hobby and have reviews of various wargames, but the Wargames Design book gives us a glimpse inside SPI and how they work. In fact, one of the key reasons that it is so important is that it contains sales figures from SPI at the time of its publications. At that time, SPI had unit sales for the entire line of all their games of about 420,000 units a year. And they were selling to an audience that was estimated by James Dunnigan to be about 100 to 150,000 active gamers. It's on page 140 of this book. He says that that's what it is at the largest. And at that time, the average cost of a war game was about $8 in 1977 dollars, meaning that they had about $3.4 million in annual sales. Now, it's not profit, but that's the sales for a single company. Now, if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can see that this is the equivalent of about $18 million in 2024 dollars. So that's not a huge market, but it actually is a pretty significant base of gamers at the time. And in fact, the way that I would describe it is that SPI was a big business in a small market. They held about 50% of the market share by units sold at that time, so their 420,000 units were about half of all war games produced in 1977. And they held about a 43% market share and percentage of cash spent by wargamers. But in 1977, it was a time of significant transitions in the gaming industry. At that time, double gamers made up about 30% of all money spent on war games at the time. This was also the time of a rise of a new kind of game, the fantasy role-playing game. As the recent 50th anniversary celebration of Dungeons & Dragons has reminded us, the publication of D&D altered the gaming landscape forever by creating a new market for the sales of games. The role-playing game market expanded from this small gaming market of 100,000 to 150,000 tabletop wargamers to a community of millions of gamers. In fact, by 2000, there were over 2 million people playing tabletop role-playing games on a monthly basis. This is according to Ryan Dancy and the research that he did for TSR. And you can read this on the blog post that's related to this on the Geekerati Media Substack site. The point here is that the market in 1977 wasn't yet in the millions. But SPI was a smart enough company that it realized that the market was in flux and that these newfangled role-playing games and miniatures games were where the money was headed. They gathered together some of their best and brightest designers, Eric Goldberg, David James Ritchie, Edward J. Woods, Greg Kostikian, who is a huge name in the industry, and Redmond Simonson. And they got these people together, they're kind of best of the best, to produce their own role-playing game, DragonQuest. The resulting product was published in 1980. It had a great deal of fanfare, but it received less than stellar reviews. You know, we grognards often talk about how original D&D was a miniatures wargame with rules and advice, mostly advice, very little rules, for role-playing. Heck. I've written several newsletter entries about how each edition of D&D, up to and including the present one, are complex tactical wargames. If you want to know more about it, just go to my Substack and type Zone of Control or Zones of Control, and you'll learn more about it. D&D is a game that has zones of control in it. D&D is very much a miniatures game, but that is different in many respects than the token and map wargaming, at least with regard to how the rules are presented. If you compare Tony Bath's rules for medieval combat to those of Squad Leader, you'll get a good picture of the difference. If you go to my Substack and read my review or discussion of DragonQuest there, I've provided copies of Tony Bath's initial rules for medieval warfare, as well as the 4th edition rules for Squad Leader for you to look at. And you can see the difference, right? Tony Bath's rules are open. They're abstract. They're filled with innovation, but they're easy to play, quick to play. The focus here is on fun and getting it over with quickly, right? There's very little minutia. That's a part of the wargaming hobby in England at the time. They just want to have fun. They just want to have a good time. They don't care about points. They just want the story of the conflict. Whereas Squad Leader is a series of rules that reads like a legal textbook. And if you compare those rules, you'll see this. It's really, really apparent. In fact, I want to read to you out loud, and I'll show a clip of this up above. You can see it right here, what I'm going to say. Some of the rules from DragonQuest when it came out. This is the 1st edition. Things changed with the 2nd edition, but in 1st edition. Rule 15.2. Gotta love it. Point 2. A character who is adjacent to, but not in the attack zone of, a hostile character may employ actions A, B, C, E, F, H, J, L, M, P, Q, R, S, T, and X. Notice, these are not all the letters of the alphabet that are available to people. These are just some of the letters. And we're not even done yet with this rule that is supposed to be clear and easy to understand using the case system. He could not implement action G or W. Further, while he could fire, he could not fire at an adjacent character. He could also hurl a weapon, but again, not at an adjacent character. This is from DragonQuest, 1st edition, page 20, and it's rule 15.2. Once again, 15.2. In addition to releasing this as a role-playing game, SBI published the combat rules for DragonQuest as a standalone game entitled Arena of Death in their own house magazine, Ares, in its 4th issue at the time, and later as a standalone boxed game. Needless to say, this is not easy to read for the average role-playing gamer. In fact, it's not easy to read for your average board gamer, let alone a neophyte entering the marketplace, desiring to learn how to play a game for the first time. To give you an example of how this was accepted by the gaming community at large, experienced tabletop wargamer Forrest Johnson reviewed the game for Space Gamer magazine, and his review used the same case-based, legalistic format as the DragonQuest role-playing game. Rule 1.784. Design in haste. Repent at leisure. With all its talented staff, SBI has managed to do what companies like TSR and Metagaming have done with lesser resources. Mess up a promising new system. DragonQuest is not your dream game, and appearing in 1980, it is at a competitive disadvantage, but it was put together by professionals. Despite its faults, it still presents a pleasing contrast to the sloppiness of the fantasy trip, the illogic of D&D, the incoherence of chivalry and sorcery. It borrows good ideas liberally from the older systems and offers some new innovations of its own, Furthermore, the planned supplements, if only half of them see print, will make an incredibly rich game. Now notice, this is a positive review, but it is making fun of the fact that DragonQuest used an arcane and difficult to understand presentation system. Similarly, the Chaosium affiliated magazine Different Worlds, in issue 11, had a review that stated that DragonQuest functions as an FRP game, that's fantasy role-playing game, the same way a sledgehammer functions as a mousetrap. Both get the job done, but the effort involved in getting it to work is not worth the end result. This review prompted a response from Eric Goldberg, one of the designers at SPI, which stated, "While mice have escaped from conventional mousetraps, none have survived being splattered about by a sledgehammer." Now, it should be noted that Eric Goldberg and all of the SPI designers at the time were active in responding to any criticism against SPI games, to the point of almost absurdity, that it really was bizarre that they would defend some of the things that they defended. Now, to be fair, they are talented designers and these are good games, but many of their defenses just are to the level of, why are you bothering? The first edition combat rules were bogged down by the fact that this structure and design was modeled after traditional token and map wargames rule structure, and the design was modeled after these same wargame presentations and not the more narrative presentation of role-playing games. And had they listened to critics like Forrest Johnson and others, they could have made this change, but instead they just decided to defend their game instead of be reasonable and listen first. Now, to be fair, they did eventually listen, but the combat rules as they were presented were difficult to understand and extraordinarily mechanical to play. DragonQuest included many innovations in its magic system and in its skill system, as well as its universal attribute test system. But the combat system of the first edition was arcane and overly complex, and I have to tell you, when I played it with my group, it was the slowest, most cautious combat of all time. It was realistic in the sense that it felt like the scene in Maximilian when Maximilian and the other person are fighting in armor and nothing happens for a long time. They just zoned one another and just kept waiting for the other to take action. That might have been realistic because, the scene in Maximilian is realistic, but it was not fun to play. But it should be noted that even as resistant as Eric Goldberg and the other people were at the time to the criticism, they did listen. They responded quickly to the need to improve the game and released the second edition in 1981 within a year. That edition included one name that stands out to me. And the name is in their list of games testing and advice. I believe this name made all the difference in the world, and that name is Greg Gordon. Greg Gordon is one of the best game designers in the business. He worked on DC Heroes, which I think is the best game design ever, Torg, Deadlands, you name it. He is one of the best, absolute best designers in the entire industry. And the changes between the two editions, in addition to seeing what, Gordon's later work is, lead me to believe he was the major influence or the major difference in the second edition. So to give you an example, this is Rule 15.2 in the second edition of DragonQuest. Figures with a modified agility of 22 to 25 are allowed one extra hex of movement when executing any of the following actions: a melee attack, evade, withdraw, pass, and retreat. Thus, Eaglewing the Elf, whose modified agility is 25 due to the lack of weight he is carrying, his natural agility, and his bonus due to being an elf, can move 3 hexes while preparing his tulwar, that's a weapon, instead of 2. You'll notice here a couple of things. First, we're no longer getting maneuvers listed as letters of the alphabet. And second, we're being given a visceral example with a character name, Eaglewing the Elf. This is a huge change. So the second edition of the game kept all the interesting quirks of the first edition. It's still an extraordinarily tactical system, but it cleaned up the play of the combat system and made many other minor tweaks in the system, including presenting it in a narrative format that's easy to understand for the non-technical gamer. It also added tons of images, miniatures in use in play, and clear examples of gameplay, just like above. You get the names of characters. We are hearing and seeing what gameplay is. After all, it wasn't the granular tactical rules that made DragonQuest unapproachable. It was the fact that they were written like a legal textbook for advanced legal scholars who had a deep knowledge of existing precedents and prior publications. For the common gamer, it was completely obscure. To give you an example of why I know it was the way it was written and not how complex the miniatures rules were, there was another game published around the same time called Champions, which was equally tactical, equally miniatures based, but the rules were presented in a less arcane format. Once again, not reading like a legal textbook that required deep understanding of precedent. That game eased newer gamers into the format and allowed them to play a highly complex tactical rule system, and they did. And that game exploded and continues to have a large fan base, a relatively large fan base. Sadly, even Champions doesn't have the fan base that it should, but, you know, it's bigger than DragonQuest. Though I should note, DragonQuest has a deeply devoted fan base today, and deservedly so, because this second edition is the bee's knees. You really need to check it out. With these revisions, DragonQuest seemed ready to take the market by storm. I'm telling you, this is a great game. It was primed and ready in 1981 to become SPI's big hit. But guess what? TSR, the publishers of D&D, purchased SPI on March 31st, 1982. This purchase will become the subject of a future video because it's really its own issue. But regardless of the how and why of that purchase, this had a significant influence on DragonQuest's fate because the purchase meant that DragonQuest did not get any support from TSR, or at least future support was minimal at best. This is because TSR, under the Bloom Brothers, had no real plan for supporting and releasing SPI products, any SPI products. And they focused on their own games instead of any of the SPI games they bought. And they bought a game company that was the second largest game company in wargaming at the time and had a 50% market share. Maybe it had shrunk to 30% by that time, but it was still a massive market share. And they had no idea what to do with it. That is remarkable. The eventual supporting material that was released by TSR did include 6 articles supporting the DragonQuest role-playing game in Dragon Magazine, including one that I love to read about non-magical characters in DragonQuest. But there was a rumored 4th rulebook for the game DragonQuest that was called Arcane Wisdom that never hit the stands. There's currently a fan-based version of Arcane Wisdom that you can find on the internet, but it's not the full game rulebook that was promised to fans of the game in 1981. But it wasn't just the lack of interest by TSR in DragonQuest that led to its lack of support. It was also the fact that when TSR bought SPI, most of the key SPI designers immediately left the company to work for a new company called Victory Games. Gerard Klug, John Butterfield, and Greg Gordon all went to work for the new company. Within a year of their leaving TSR/SPI for Victory Games, these designers created the James Bond 007 role-playing game, which built on many of the concepts presented in DragonQuest, but completely abandoned the old-school wargame rules in presentation and in tone. The diaspora of these game designers from TSR, SPI, to Victory Games will be discussed in a later post, but let me just say that when it comes to who to blame for them leaving the company, no. It was not Lorraine Williams' fault. You can't blame her. You can blame the Blooms, and you can blame these designers themselves, and you can blame the people who made the deal to sell SPI to TSR. The fact of the matter is TSR bought a company for its assets, and its key assets, which weren't the games, but rather the game designers, immediately left. They had no obligation to stay, and they didn't. They formed a new company, worked with Avalon Hill, a competitor of TSR, and made some fantastic games. So what was the fate of DragonQuest? Well, it languished for a long period of time, but TSR eventually published a cleaned up and revised third edition of the rules set in 1989, the same year that they published second edition AD&D. But for all the improvements that edition made to the mechanics of the game, it lost so much of the flair of the original game that made it entertaining. As with the other role-playing games released around the same time as AD&D's second edition. In fact, this is midway through Lorraine Williams' tenure at the company, so in this case, Lorraine Williams is to blame. TSR decided to pander to the satanic panic purveyors and released a much tamer version thematically of the game. Gone were the College of Greater Summonings with its demon-bound magicians, which was really a central and cool component of the original edition. And in was a lighter tone, similar to the many culture word scared products, which was similar to many of the Culture Wars scared products that TSR was publishing at the time. Remember, AD&D second edition had no devils and demons. They had Tanari and Beta Zoo. I don't know what those are, but they're not demons and they're not devils, but they are, right? We just don't want to use the name because we don't want to make the satanic panic people mad. It was a huge mistake to do that. They did that in second edition AD&D. They did that with third edition DragonQuest. The third edition of the game is a good rule set. In fact, it plays extraordinarily well. But if you're going to play the game, or if you're going to pick up a copy, I recommend the second edition. It has a rich feel of magic with the magical colleges, and those are one of the best features of that game. DragonQuest is an extremely interesting game, but it's currently a dead game outside of a pretty deeply committed but small community of avid gamers. That doesn't, as I said, it's a dead game, but that doesn't mean that people aren't playing it today. There are. And there's quite a vibrant community of longtime gamers who have their own living rules for the game. You can find them, and maybe I'll link them below so that you can access them on your own. It's a shame, though, that this isn't a game supported by Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, or by the companies that have the licenses to SBI games purchased from Hasbro. Because it does have a really interesting setting, and if you're a tactically minded role-playing gamer who really likes the nuances of hex-based battles with complex combat puzzles, it's one of the best games out there. And I think the rules could be cleaned up even more to make them a little more streamlined. But if you keep that skill system and the schools of magic that make DragonQuest unique, man, I think that would emulate a lot of the fantasy books that are out there significantly better than Dungeons & Dragons currently does. In fact, Dungeons & Dragons right now, the only fantasy it emulates is Dungeons & Dragons fantasy. It no longer is Tolkien-esque, it's no longer pulp fiction, it is D&D fantasy. And that's okay, but you might want to play in a different kind of fantasy. Interestingly, DragonQuest has a legacy outside of the gaming community, because its legacy is not limited to the small and dedicated group of gamers who still play it. It has a literary legacy. James Barclay's Chronicles of the Raven, which I bought from the Science Fiction Book Club, the books of that series are based on his own DragonQuest campaign. This excellent series of books, in fact, not only was fun to read, but it inspired my own third edition campaign. In that campaign, my players, their characters, discovered that the elves of the world, in this case I was playing in Greyhawk, but the elves of Greyhawk were all dying of a withering sickness. And the players needed their characters to find the cause and to hopefully eventually find a way to cure it. That cause turned out to be that Grumsh had invaded the home of the Seldarine on Isgard and pierced Corlin Learathan with a fragment of Thurisdan, leaving his comatose body bleeding into Ysgard's fount of life. So in Elf Sorrow, you find out that there's like this pool of life for the elves, and I put it in Ysgard as a kind of fountain that was there and that Corlin Lorethian guarded. And Grumsh attacked him and pierced him with this spear made of the essence of Thurisdan, and he was then comatose and bleeding into this font. And this font of life, being the source of all life for the elves, meant that their lives were tainted and they were dying, being corrupted by the essence of the Elder Elemental Eye. In the course of the campaign, it took years for the characters and the players to discover this cause, and by that time, the player characters were strong enough to begin the final quest of the campaign. And this was a quest where they needed to revive Corlon, they needed to defeat Grumsh, they had to defeat an avatar of Thurisdan. On the way to doing that, they had to defeat the Tarask in order to gain the adamantine from the inside of the Tarask's stomach in order to forge the weapons that they needed to use against Grumsh. It was, in my opinion, a lot of fun, maybe a little over the top, but it was that kind of 4 Balrogs in your first encounter. Although in this case, it was after 10 years, because the campaign lasted for almost a decade, and it was just a glorious way for the campaign to end. They ended up fighting, one of the avatars of Grumsh inside this huge floating heart that was the heart of Thurisdan floating over Isgard, and they defeated him. They destroyed the heart, and they had a great time. And none of this would have existed without DragonQuest. Right? DragonQuest as a game inspired James Barkley to write his series. I read Elf Sorrow. I was like, oh my gosh, this is a wonderful book. It's really sad and tragic. How can I apply this to my game? And that's really what happened, right? That its legacy, I'm making it personal, but it has a literary legacy and then it has a personal legacy, even without me running a DragonQuest campaign. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about role-playing games is they don't always need to be successful, that you don't always even need to play that actual game for it to have a long-term effect on the hobby and on your own personal in-house game. In my case, my campaign was influenced by a literary book series that was inspired by a game. And that game is a lot of fun, and I recommend checking it out. So thank you for listening to my show. Thank you for reading the Geekerati Substack, and I'll see you next week.
Shall we play a game?
This geek of technology.
He's a Highlander, by God.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play.